Are you looking for a different way to experience Japan from the comfort of your own home? Look no further than Tokyo Treat. Tokyo Treat is a monthly pop Japanese subscription box that brings you 20 of the latest, exclusive, limited edition, and seasonal flavored Japanese snacks that are only available otherwise in Japan. Some only for a limited time, like Sakura Pepsi, Japanese sake Kit Kats, ramen, and a lot more. September's box helps bring the celebration of tsukimi, or Japanese moon viewing, to you and your taste buds. This centuries-old tradition is a time to go outdoors and appreciate the beauty of the autumn moon and hopefully cooler weather while giving thanks for the harvest. Well, Tokyo Treat has harvested some tsukimi-themed snacks just for you to enjoy under the moonlight with friends and family, including chestnut-flavored Kit Kats, mint chocolate moon pebbles, full moon rice crackers, and more. Check out the booklet inside your curated box for more information about the snacks you'll receive, as well as allergen information and a wealth of details about Japanese culture. Sign up today, whether it's for you or maybe just as a gift for a friend or a family member, and use our promo code KOJPODCAST, KOJPODCAST, and check our show notes or link tree for more details. Yoroshiku ne. With only 3 episodes left in Season 4, we'll be recording our Season 4 recap episode within the next couple weeks, but we want to hear from you. Got some feedback, stories, requests, input, almost anything really. Send us an email to crewofjapanpodcast, kreweofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. Can't wait to see that email inbox bursting at the brim. And who knows, maybe even yours will get read on the episode. Until then, we look forward to hearing from you guys. Here's what's going on with Japan Society of New Orleans. Come out to the Jefferson Performing Arts Center on Wednesday, September 20th from 5:30 to 8:30 and hang with Japan Society in New Orleans, among so many other organizations at Culture Collision 13. The event is free and open to the public. Check the Japan Society website for more details. Also, October is just around the corner, and that means Japan Fest is as well. Japan Fest is being held on October 14th all day at New Orleans Museum of Art. Japan Society will be looking for some volunteers to work our table and samurai armor try-on station. So keep your eyes peeled for the sign-up email coming in the next few weeks. Or just check out the Japan Society website for more details. Let's go! Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Crew of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Crew of Japan podcast.
Welcome back to our podcast. Growing up in the late 1980s and 1990s, when someone wanted to play video games, they didn't say, I want to play a video game. They said, I want to play Nintendo. Nintendo was, during that time, the Band-Aid of video games. The Nintendo brand ruled supreme. It was video games. However, technology has evolved so much, and the sheer volume of options available in the video game industry make it virtually impossible for any one company to achieve the level of brand awareness that Nintendo possessed during the 80s and 90s. But how did Nintendo get there? That kind of domination doesn't just happen overnight. Lucky for you, today we'll find out, as this episode is a crossover event. Pop culture meets Japanese and really world history. Back in the late spring, the crew sat down with Matt Alt, our first ever podcast guest, acclaimed author of Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World, co-host of Pure Tokyoscope podcast, and, as one of our listeners actually called him, the modern-day Lafcadio Hearn. During his research for Pure Invention, Matt dug deep into the history of the company that we all know as Nintendo, from its humble beginnings as a playing card company to its various pivots along the way, before its transformation into the behemoth in the video game industry. So naturally, Matt was the first person we thought of when coming up with this episode. Anyway, let's get started. So insert your coin, sit back, and enjoy this pop culture history lesson on the beloved Nintendo company as told by Matt Alt. Let's go. All right, and we're back with the podcast, and we have a familiar face with us today. We have obviously Jennifer, our one of our primary familiar faces, being that she's a co-host, and I always forget to introduce her. But we have Jennifer, but we also have another familiar face who may as well be a co-host for this podcast because he's been on here so many times. This is the 4th time. I think you're our first 4-peat.
I keep turning up like a bad Yenny.
No.
So you opened our series. It's Matt Alt, by the way.
Oh yeah,
you
open our... say who it is, right? Exactly.
I didn't actually say who it was. We have Matt Alt with us of Pure Invention fame, of Pure Tokyo Scope fame, if you listen to podcasts.
And let's not forget the new Pure Invention newsletter, which I just launched. You can
on
find
your
it
Substack, right?
Yes, pureinventionbook.com. It's there, pureinventionbook.com/newsletter. Please check it out, as we used to say in NHK.
Yes, and like we were saying, like you are our first guest ever, our first repeat guest, our first guest co-host.
Well, thank you.
When we did the Gene Pelk episode last year.
It's an honor. It's an honor.
So really. Many firsts for us.
You know, I'm always down when Nola is in the picture. You know, it's like
we're still waiting on that visit.
Yeah, I know. There's so many cocktail bars to visit, so little time.
Whenever you do, drop us a line.
I will. We'll have to podcast from the city. We'll have to do it.
Yes,
from there.
We'll have to figure that out. We'll do it like either a live stream or something. I don't know.
Yes,
we'll figure something
out. My dream is that we do the podcast from not Lafcadio Hearn, because his house I think is not open to the public, but the Jokichi Takamine's house, the inventor of Japanese whiskey. I'd love to do that.
We're still working on that from our sidebar conversation.
Yes, he's right there. His house is right there at the edge of the quarter. We should totally do it.
When this episode comes out, it'll be probably way past the point of when we're talking about it. I'm trying to meet up with you, but
all right,
I'll try to meet up with you. You can show me some cocktail bars.
Absolutely, that's what I do.
It's your job.
It is, exactly.
But your other job is being ingrained in Japanese pop culture. As one of our listeners referred to you on a Reddit, I was on there sharing one of our Tokusatsu episodes, and they referred to you as a modern-day Lafcadio Hearn.
That's nice. Wow.
Nice.
That's so
what an
nice.
honor.
That's like, I think every person who comes to Japan and makes a living writing aspires to be that, but it's nobody can call themselves that. I don't think of myself that way, but it's really an honor. It's an honor to be said of me. Thank you, whoever you are.
I know who it is, and I'll send that thanks to them later
Ghost
on.
Lafcadio Hearn himself.
Since you are so well versed in pretty much everything pop culture Japan, and you've done so much research over the years for your book and for all of the things you talk about. One of the big topics, and especially with the release of the new Zelda game, Tears of the Kingdom, we wanted to talk about the history of Nintendo and just kind of do a historical deep dive, kind of find out their roots, and then travel a long time with them to see how it got to modern day, to where we got to present day Nintendo life and how they exist in not only in Japan, but also the modern world.
Lots of twists and turns in that tale.
Oh, yeah. Let's start off with the early days. Nintendo is known now as a video game powerhouse globally, but not everyone knows its like true origin story of being in a playing card company, right?
Definitely.
Can you tell us a little bit about the early days of Nintendo as a playing card company?
Well, first of all, I think I should kind of establish, why I'm talking about
please.
this. I'm not an employee of Nintendo. I never have been. I've played Nintendo, big surprise there. I did a deep dive on Nintendo's history when I wrote Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World. And I spoke at length to many people involved directly and peripherally with Nintendo, most interestingly with Masayuki Uemura, who was the engineer of the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, and many other products. He actually headed up R&D 2 team. There were two research and development teams there, one led by a gentleman who you may have heard of named Gunpei Yokoi, who is famed as the kind of mentor of Mario's creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, and the engineer of the Game Boy. So Uemura-san, who unfortunately passed away a little over a year ago, gave me a lot of insight into how things worked inside Nintendo, which is great because he's retired, and people who actually work for Nintendo don't talk about Nintendo. It's
I feel like, do they have like a clause in their contract to not allow them to talk about it?
Is that what it is? It's like the family La Familia, It's like
I definitely feel like that's the way. But don't you have to like sign something like a release form to even go into headquarters?
What happens in Kyoto stays in Kyoto. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, this actually is a good lead in to what you asked about because Uemura-san Kyoto-san told me, and I've heard this from many other sources, Kyoto is, I've spent my entire life and career in Japan in Tokyo. I'm a Tokyo guy. But Kyoto is a very different sort of place. It's a very different sort of atmosphere. It was once the capital of Japan many, many centuries ago. And many of the people who live there still feel like it's the capital. And it's kind of its own little world. It's very traditional. Tradition has been more preserved there, not least of which because Kyoto was struck from the list of bombing targets during World War II by I forget what his title was. Stimson. He was like the head of the War Department during the 1940s and had visited Kyoto and struck it off the list because he felt that it would be too much of it was a beautiful city. And it would be too much of a kind of emotional blow to the Japanese to lose it.
I think I've heard that story before too.
Yeah, it's
true. It's true, and it's pretty well known actually.
Yes.
That Kyoto was kind of like off limits because it was such a amazing place that they were like, we can't do that.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a war like materiel place. It was a site of culture and history, and it just so happened that one of the Americans in charge of the bombing campaign decided to, and I think he did it kind of unilaterally. I think he kind of snuck in and scraped it off the list, scratched it off. Unfortunately, that meant some other city got wasted in its place. So this isn't like really something to celebrate. But at any rate, Kyoto survived World War II relatively unscathed. And actually, that's why Pure Invention is the opening chapter is set there. The toy industry relaunched in Kyoto in 1945, which leads again to Nintendo. So Nintendo got its start in 1889 as a purveyor of Hanafuda cards. And they're called playing cards sometimes in English, but they're not playing cards like we think of as, that we use in like bridge or poker or something like that. They're used in a traditional game of gambling. And there was a big fad for them in the Edo period, late Edo, early Meiji period when Nintendo started. And they're very colorful. They're made of washi paper. They're more like cardboard than they are like we think of as playing cards. And they have very fun patterns on them. And again, they're used in a game of gambling. And so when you say gambling in Japan, you inevitably also link that to gangsters. And while Nintendo was not in any way, shape, or form like a gang-affiliated company, it's a fact that many of the people who consumed this product were. And particularly by the time that Hiroshi Yamauchi took over in the immediate post-war era, it was a family-run company. It was run by the Yamauchi family. And they made these Hanafuda cards for many decades. But by the early post-war era, that game had really fallen out of favor. It was seen as super old-fashioned. It was seen as something that, kind of polite society didn't engage in. And Nintendo was still running its lines. It had very, these big production lines to make the cards because there's all sorts of processes involved in making them and things like that. But the company was kind of struggling after World War II to find its way. And the grandson of the gentleman who was running the company, the grandson being named Hiroshi Yamauchi, was basically tapped to lead the company and took over and tasked himself with modernizing it. I'm leaving a lot of detail and steps out here, but this is basically it. And Hiroshi Yamauchi is the gentleman who kind of shepherded Nintendo in its evolution from making these cards into the company that we know it today. He was there for that entire arc of that.
Okay.
And isn't now like the old headquarters a hotel? Like you could actually stay there?
So there's actually, if you go to downtown Kyoto, it's actually really quite near the station. There is an old Nintendo building there. And I've heard that there was, for a long time, it was just kind of fenced off. And I don't know what Nintendo was using it for. It was still in great repair. It wasn't like abandoned or anything. But the only thing you could see was like a metal plate that said, the Nintendo Playing Card Company on the outside. I have heard that they are doing something with that.
I think it's a hotel.
So that makes sense because Nintendo is now really actively tapping into its, for lack of a better word, soft power, its kind of charisma around. It's finally leaning into its being more than just a video game company and like a kind of turning into kind of a lifestyle company, sort of like how Studio Ghibli has done in recent years.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, Nintendo has ventured off into many other things besides the playing cards. It's dabbled into like love hotels and taxis and stuff.
Oh yeah, no, we'll get into that. So what happens is in 1948, Yamauchi's grandfather, who is the president of Nintendo, has a stroke. And they basically yank Yamauchi. Yamauchi left Kyoto. He went to Tokyo. He's going to Waseda University. By all accounts, he's very wealthy, which isn't the case for most Japanese at the time. And so he's this kind of dandy. He's like living it up in the big city of Tokyo. He's, having fun. He's partying. He's going to university, which is something in 1948 that a lot of Japanese people didn't do. So he's already kind of part of the upper crust. He's already part of the elite and has a very sort of different background than the average Japanese. Because remember, in 1948, Japan has been leveled. It has been totally leveled. The Tokyo that Yamauchi was in was literally like huge sections of it must have looked like, no joke, like parts of Ukraine look now. Like tanks, just destroyed streetcars, destroyed roads, destroyed buildings. And he's studying law. And he really, really wanted to complete that degree, but he never did because with the stroke of his grandfather, he had to be pulled out and run Nintendo. And he had no experience running a big company. He's a young guy. He's like a college student. And he actually, in those early years, had a bunch of issues with his workers. They didn't want to listen to him. And it finally came to a head where he basically, in a Godfather-style move, fired all of the there was a strike, and then there was or a threat of a strike, and he basically just fired all of the people who were loyal to his grandfather and installed new people in the company and turned Nintendo into his own. And it was kind of a brutal thing, but it was something that had to happen because now he had full control over the company.
Yeah, I can imagine the tug of war going back and forth with that.
Because it's a traditional company. Like they probably saw Yamauchi as like a fop, you know what I mean? Who is this dandified kid from the big city, with his suits and his, his champagne tastes coming in and telling us, the people of Kyoto, the workers who've been here for generations, what to do. Yeah. It was an interesting position to be in, I think. I heard from Uemura-san that basically Nintendo was sort of looked down on in Kyoto society. It was not back then, it was not the top rungs of society, not only because they were making these Hanafuda cards, but because they had been quote unquote only founded in 1889, they were seen as an upstart. Even in the 1950s. Kyoto is a city that is full of traditional shops that are hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
And in the social hierarchy of that city, the artisans and the craftspeople who have inherited traditions that are hundreds of years old are at the top. And these kind of, if you've only got 100 under your belt, well, hey kid, you got nothing learning to do,
So funny thinking about that, just from an American perspective, where it's U.S. is only how many years old?
right?
But I'm sure getting that new blood into the company was the turning point.
Yeah, well, of course, because, suddenly you have this 20-something, kid, full of piss and vinegar, as they say, running the company. And Yamauchi was somebody who was not I think maybe because he had suffered through that mutiny early on and because he knew Nintendo was not, necessarily looked up to in Kyoto, I think he felt like he had a lot of room to innovate and to try new things and do new things. And he wanted to be successful. He really wanted to win, quote unquote. I don't think in a sense of dominating other companies, although that does come into the picture later on, but in terms of, proving that he was the right guy to run this. So over the 50s and, early 60s, he starts really modernizing things. Nintendo was, for a very long time in the post-war era and really up until the late 70s, a toy company. The way they became a toy company was Yamauchi was the first person to make playing cards. Playing cards at the time, in the early 50s, were associated with gambling too. But then he had the idea of, what if we put Disney characters on them? What if we put Disney characters on them and sell them to kids so we can expand the market just from scuzzy adults into children? And so he went to America and he actually met with Roy Disney. This is 1959, I think, 1960. He goes over and he negotiates with Roy Disney. I don't think he made it up to Walt, but Roy. And Roy gave him a tour of the Magic Kingdom. This was the first time Yamauchi saw the power of characters and licensing. And I'm sure he liked what he saw. He sees somebody in the States who turned a mouse into a literal kingdom, over there, right? And so he brings this Disney thing back, and his playing cards were a huge hit with the Disney characters on them. And they were placed not in the stores that you would normally see cards in, they were placed in toy stores. So this gave Nintendo its kind of first toehold into that area. And it was important because there's a big baby boom going on, right? There's a lot of kids.
Right. From there, do they only stick to that toy and children's realm of products? Jen had mentioned earlier the taxis and the love hotels.
Yes.
Where they still maintain that presence in like the adult world.
So yeah, what happened was that even though these playing cards did really well, and he's selling at one point they're selling hundreds of thousands of units a year, right? And he's dominating the playing card market. But Yamauchi isn't like the kind of guy who's going to be satisfied with just like simple success. And he realizes that, no matter how big of a playing card company he becomes, there's limits to what he can do. And so he decides to start diversifying. Okay. And this is where things get really interesting. In the 60s, Nintendo is doing all sorts of crazy stuff, or I should say Yamauchi. He founds, he purchases a taxi company. And then he also, in concert with that, buys a share in and takes ownership of a love hotel, which is, as you know, in Japan, a kind of a place for like a by the hour place for trysting with your lover, right? And this
Lovers.
Lovers, yeah, because this is the thing. There were a lot of newspaper articles at the time that were making fun of Yamauchi because he was reportedly a big customer of this. Like it makes sense when you think about it, because the taxi driver, you'd get into a taxi with your girlfriend or whoever it was and say, hey, a good place we can go? And the taxi driver is like, yeah, buddy, the Nintendo Love Hotel. And he'd take you over there, right? or whatever love hotel that your taxi service was affiliated with. So this is like one step away from like being a kind of brothel type situation,
yeah.
Really. Right? It's really different than what you think of Nintendo today.
So were they branded as Nintendo, or they have another name? Completely separate from
the taxi company was called Daya, I think, and I think it's still in business today. It was like I don't think he founded it. I think he acquired it. Like Taxi Love Hotel, like they were kind of like a package deal. But it's not that like he's like, maybe we should get into the Mustang Ranch business. I think it was just Yamauchi-san was an incredibly entrepreneurial guy. If he saw an angle, he went for it, and he didn't care what other people thought. And so after that, like he realized, obviously that's not going to make the company big either. They're probably making some money off of it. And they start doing like, they get involved with like a instant rice venture. And so they're making like instant rice. They're doing all of these things and they're just not really working. But it's interesting because, Yamauchi has the resources coming in from the playing cards and his own wealth to be able to take weird chances.
I studied a little bit about Japanese business history when I was a study abroad student at Sophia University. Right. And, hearing about the Zaibatsu and the Keiretsu and stuff, where they literally had, there was a company, but there are so many subdivisions of that company. Yeah. Like the spectrum of what type of products they offered was vast.
Oh, sure.
This sounds kind of similar in that, like, it was in that same mindset.
Yamauchi was the kind of guy who knew how to exploit a niche, but like he didn't really know how to launch one. And so that's why when you're talking like in the 60s, he's just kind of casting around, splashing about. And Nintendo of the 60s was not like even remotely on anybody's radar, except maybe locally. They were doing well with the playing cards, but it was just this little company run by this odd guy who's just kind of trying desperately to come up with hits. But the Nintendo story really takes a turn in the mid-60s when a young guy by the name of Gunpei Yokoi joins up. And Yokoi was, Kyoto born, raised, educated, but he wasn't particularly ambitious. And when he graduated from university, he just wanted to stay in Kyoto. And he just took a job on, he was an engineer, and he took a job as a kind of a maintenance guy, maintaining Nintendo's Hanafuda lines. And these are like these big machines. And so he's basically a service dude. He's like one step removed from a janitor. But Yokoi is a pretty inventive guy. And he loves like making things and like going into the workshop and bashing things together. And actually, that's why he took the job with Nintendo. It was so low stress that would give him time to kind of like experiment and play around during the day, even during work and on his free time. At one point, he uses the lathe and some other parts in the machine shop to come up with this accordion hand toy. that's called that's like, it's like one of those things out of the Warner Brothers, like Looney Tunes, like you can use it and extend the hand across the room with like these accordion, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Like the metal bars kind of scissoring together.
Yeah.
I don't know what you call that in English or even in Japanese.
I don't know either.
It's like a big spring hand that comes out, and like he and the guys in the factory are playing around with it when Yamauchi hears about it, and Yamauchi's like, "Send that guy to my office immediately." And Yokoi is like, "Oh man, I finally did it. Like I had like the easiest job in the world and I'm finally getting fired." And he kind of trudges up to Yamauchi's office, and Yamauchi's like, "Kid, this thing's great. Make a toy out of it." And Yokoi is like, "What?" Like his head's spinning and then it's spinning the other way. He's like, "What?" He's like, "It's just a stupid hand thing, boss. How am I going to make a toy out of it?" And he's like, "I don't care. Make a toy out of it." Slam, it kicks, Yokoi out of the office. Yokoi goes back down to his room and he comes up with this half-assed, okay, you can use it to like stack balls in cups or something like that. He puts like suction cups on the end of it and he comes up with something, and it's really, he's like, I don't know, I guess it's a toy. And Yamauchi sees it and he's like, whatever, that's fine, great, let's do it. And they dub it the Ultra Hand. Now, there's something to note here. This comes out in 1966, and there's something else that came out in 1966. It's called Ultraman, the live-action science fiction series starring a dude in a giant silver and red suit who karate chops kaiju into submission. It was the biggest thing in Japan in 1966. It was huge. It kicked off this boom for kaiju stuff that arguably has persisted into the present day because everybody loves kaiju. But it's no coincidence that Yamauchi chose to call this thing the Ultra Hand. None at all.
Rhymes, sorta?
Yeah. Ultra Hand.
Or not even rhymes.
Ultraman's hand.
Sounds like the same damn thing.
So this, exactly. And then this thing turns into a major hit. Like huge hit. Like giant hit.
So were the copyright rules kind of loose back then? Like, I guess Ultra wasn't really like copyrighted.
So this is the thing.
We'll play with it.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know that you could even copyright this. Ultra is a word, right? It's like an adjective, I guess. Is it?
Yeah.
Adverb?
Plus Ultra, right?
Yeah, plus Ultra.
So the fascination with this is a kind of sidebar, but the reason Japanese are and kind of are still obsessed with the word Ultra is that during the Olympics, which had been just a couple years before, the Japanese gymnast, one of the Japanese gymnasts used, and I can't remember, is it the parallel bars or or is it the hanging ring thing? I'm not sure. They used a technique called the Ultra C to win the gold medal. And that just injected Ultra, and there's all sorts of Ultras in Japanese pop culture of the 60s. There's Ultraman, of course, and there's this Ultra Hand. There's Ultra B, who is an Ultra Baby, and that's like a kind of character from Fujiko F. Fujio who went on to do Doraemon. So there's all sorts of Ultras at this time. It was like the word of the year for a while.
I'm surprised they didn't use like the word Ultra in like any of their gaming systems then, since it was like such a hype thing.
It's a good point. Like, why isn't it like the Nintendo Ultra gaming system? I don't know. Well, maybe by the 80s, by the 80s it had kind of fallen out of favor, I think.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't cool anymore to say like Ultra.
Super was the new word.
Super was the new one.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not the Ultra Nintendo system. It's the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But so this basically like flips things at Nintendo, and Yamauchi makes Yokoi the head of this new kind of like games department, and they put them in a little warehouse that's apart from the rest of Nintendo's operations and tells them to just keep innovating. And over the course of the remainder of the 60s, like Nintendo is making all sorts of toys, like puzzles, and like they actually do license Ultraman characters. They make this really cool, like kind of Ultraman, like marble on a track game.
Oh, really?
And doing, all sorts of stuff. And that's all they do is make toys. And actually at one point, this is another kind of interesting sidebar from the research in my book. The biggest toy company of the 60s in Japan was called Marusan. And they were so huge because they made soft vinyl figures of kaiju toys from the Ultraman series. And at one point, Marusan fell on kind of hard times, and it turned out they shared a bank with Nintendo. And I heard this from an ex-Marusan employee. That bank employee, when they came in for a loan, said, no, you know what? You need to merge. I think you guys should discuss merging with this company in Kyoto called Nintendo. And so Maru-san and Nintendo actually, the presidents of the two companies sat down at a hot spring resort in Atami and tried to hammer out some kind of deal where they would merge. And there were two big personalities who ran those two companies, and it didn't work out. But there's like this parallel universe where Nintendo merged with this other toy company and became an even bigger toy company instead of becoming a video gaming company. So it's really interesting, all these kind of paths less taken and stuff like that. But 60s, like they're just a toy company. That's all they are.
Right.
They're making playing cards and toys.
Games. What year did the NES or even Game & Watch? I think that was like the first one, right?
70s. That's late 70s. So we're still in the 60s.
There's still a gap between here and there when we actually get to when they actually dabble in video games.
Well, the bridge between that comes with Yokoi again. Yokoi he's a toy maker. He likes making physical toys, but he recruits this guy from Sharp named Masayuki Uemura, who you might remember. Mm-hmm. He's the guy who I said I interviewed for Pure Invention. Mm-hmm. And Yokoi and Uemura started to devise these increasingly complicated electronic toys. Most importantly, they invented a light gun that would let you shoot light beams, or more accurately, they kind of detected light beams, but it looked like you were shooting them, and like knock down targets and stuff like that. And these kind of novelty light gun toys turned out to be a hit. And Nintendo in the mid 70s decided to expand and to make like arcade style light gun shooting experiences. They called it laser clay. And they actually, I don't know if they modified real hunting rifles, but they look real. And you would use hunting rifles and you would go into a converted bowling alley where they would project clay, like pigeons, those clay targets on the wall, and you would follow them and shoot them with the light gun rifles. And they were poised to make this their big thing. This was going to be the big next thing. They hired...
precursor Duck Hunt, huh?
That's absolutely,
exactly, yeah.
That's absolutely what it is. That's absolutely. There's no coincidence that one of the first Nintendo accessories was a light gun. That's Yokoi and Uemura's invention. Anyway, they're really serious about this. They figured this is going to be the future of Nintendo, and they actually hired Sonny Chiba of Kill Bill fame and so many 70s movies. He was already an action star in Japan at that time, and he was the kind of spokes dude for laser clay. But what happened was the first oil shock hit, and the economy just crashed. Everybody stayed home, and the laser clay thing died on the vine. It just totally died, and Nintendo was screwed. This is the mid 1970s, and let me tell you, if you were to go back in time and ask any Japanese business person in the entertainment or the toy or any basically industry what they thought of Nintendo, they'd be like, oh, it's going to be out of business soon. Nobody expected anything from this company. Nothing. It was just, this is like a really, really low period. Hard to believe now, huh?
I know, yeah, because I was about to say, I mean, man, Nintendo has the last laugh.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a testament, I think, to Yamauchi's resilience, right? This is one of those guys.
Exactly.
He got shot with a light gun and got right back up, It's like the Terminator. This guy is he's unstoppable. So, fortunately for Yamauchi, he heard around this very same time that in America and Europe, these things called television games were starting to take off. Atari, Magnavox, all of these things. And so he's like, you know what? Television games, and he's the pivot master, right? He just pivots again into these. Fine, Sonny Chiba, you keep all the rifles, you keep them, use them in your productions, whatever. We're gonna pivot into video games. The only problem was they had absolutely no experience, and so he tells the guy who I interviewed, Uemura-san, just make a television game, make it. And to be brutally honest, Nintendo's first steps into this field were total copies of other companies' products. There's no gilding this lily. What's the word I'm looking for? There's no getting around this. Nintendo's first TV game product, which was called the Color TV Game 6, is just a copy of Pong. Remember Pong?
Oh, yeah.
the two little paddles and the ball, and then like they claim there's 6 games, but like one's hockey and one's like tennis, but they're all exactly the same game because there's no graphics. It's just like, you're a rectangle and like here's a square and like hit it.
I was an avid Atari player when I was a child. My dad had the old Atari, the original Atari with the little joystick with the button.
Yes.
And cartridges. Didn't have ET, but
it's funny, even as a little kid, when I got ET, I was like, man, this sucks. You know, it's just like, this is a terrible game. Probably in that exact high-pitched voice, I like to think. But so Nintendo is making all of these like knockoff games, and then they get in arcade games, and those games are knockoffs too. Like they're making like knockoffs of Space Invaders. Mm-hmm. And Space Invaders hits really big in Japan in like 78, and all these companies that like the rules of copyright on video games aren't really clear at this point, right? And so, you know, Taito is making a fortune off of Space Invaders, and then like everybody starts copying it, including Nintendo, to the point where like these lawsuits start getting thrown back and forth. And there's like this amazing, I found when I was researching the book, I found this amazing TV documentary from the era on Space Invaders, where this guy is going around to like the reporters going around to all of the Space Invaders arcades. And back then an arcade was just Space Invaders. That's what an arcade was.
At least that's all that anyone ever really cared about.
It was really one of the only big, it was the only hit game. And by the way, side note, in Nakano Broadway, they've just opened up like a replica Space Invaders cafe. Yes, I'm so excited by this. And back then in Japan, like the arcade games weren't like the big cabinets we know. They were like the cocktail style. You would sit down and play them and like put your drink on top of them and play the game. So it was a kind of different sort of experience. But like the point of this, Yamauchi's interviewed and he's like, hey man, games are games. We should. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I'll dig it up. But it's like, games are games. You can't patent or copyright a style of gameplay. You know what? I think whenever a video game company comes up with a big hit, they should share it with the other video game companies. That's what I think, because it'll make the Japanese game industry grow as a whole. Yeah, share alike.
The irony of Nintendo saying that.
They don't like this is one of the reasons it's difficult to like work with big corporations like this when you write histories of them, because there's a lot of stuff they don't want known like this. And it's really funny. And he's got his slicked back hair, he's smoking, he's like, yeah man, games, you can't patent a game. It's just like, wow, are we on the same planet, on the same universe? And it's important to note here, Nintendo can't even make its own games. They have no in-house expertise. They're outsourcing it to other companies pretty much. And this is around the time 1979, 1980, when Nintendo takes another big turn, where Yamauchi gets another big score. He hires a kid named Shigeru Miyamoto. And Miyamoto is
literal game changer.
Well, and he's not a game designer. He's not a programmer. He's a graphic designer. He's a graphic illustrator, and he's like basically doing like pamphlets for them and like font design and things like that at this point. But it's really interesting. Every other video game company on the planet is made up of programmers. Atari has like Steve Jobs and like Steve Wozniak. You have like Sharp Electronics, you have Magnavox, you have all these, all of these game companies. They're staffed by engineers. And the problem that's really cool when the engineers come up with something that really works, like, when they got the idea to turn Pong on its side and make Breakout, and then when somebody in Japan gets the idea to make Breakout a bunch of aliens and shoot lasers at them, and you get Space Invaders, right? Or Galaxia.
Yeah.
But, the skill set between like somebody who is you can be a hotshot programmer, but not know a thing about graphic design or like gameplay, right?
Yeah.
So this,
yeah,
you can be an amazing writer, but you don't know how to draw. You know what I mean? Or vice versa, which is why so many comic books have a different artist and a different writer, right?
A different writer, yeah.
Well, back in time, in the early days of the game industry, you had to be a programmer and a game designer at the same time. But since Nintendo didn't have any programmers, it all fell on people like Gunpei Yokoi and Shigeru Miyamoto to design games and then outsource it to people who would just follow their footsteps, make the game look like this, make it play like this. So ironically, Nintendo's total ineptitude at programming in-house turned into the foundation of how modern games are made. We're like, the guy directing the game or art directing the game or, is not the person actually writing the code for the game. That's not how it works. You have a game designer. A game designer designs the game, and then, or the director designs the game how he wants it to play, and then orders the art department, the programmers, the riggers, the 3D visualizers, whatever, to make the game in their vision, right? Like a movie. It's like George Lucas doesn't run the camera. He tells the camera, the cinematographer, what to do, or did back when he still made movies. So, this is a huge leap forward. Shigeru Miyamoto's not a programmer. Neither is Yokoi, but they know what's fun. Yokoi has decades of experience making toys. He knows what play is. And so Yokoi takes Miyamoto under his wing and kind of tutors him. And, there were some false starts, but then the two of them together come up with a game based on Popeye. Not just based on Popeye, based on a very specific episode of Popeye called A Dream Walking, where Popeye and Blue, they watch this cartoon together, or at least Yokoi does, and it involves Olive Oyl gets knocked on the head and is kind of sleepwalking. And she starts sleepwalking through this construction site. And Popeye and Bluto are, as always, punching each other out. They're running on the girders, they're knocking each other up and down levels, and they're trying to save Olive Oyl while they're fighting themselves at the same time. And this gives Yokoi this idea for a game set in a construction sort of environment. You can probably see where I'm going with this.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah.
The problem is the negotiations with, I think it's called King Rights Features, who owned Popeye, they took too long. And and so they're like, you know what? Forget it. Use the engine and make your own characters. You know what? Miyamoto-san, or Miyamoto-kun, because he's underneath Yokoi, just redesign this. We're going to use the same game, same levels, same everything, but get rid of Popeye and Olive Oyl and make somebody else. And Miyamoto comes back he turns Bluto into a gorilla. He turns Olive Oyl into, I think she's called Pauline. And then he turns Popeye into a character he calls Jumpman, wearing red overalls and a blue jacket and a little mustache. He doesn't look anything like Popeye. And Donkey Kong.
Like a plumber.
He looks like a plumber. He looks like, he's a plumber. I don't think there was even any background back then. Miyamoto said,
I don't think there was.
In later interviews, he said he wanted to call him Mr. Video. For a video game. And he wanted to put him in, he knew he wanted to put him in different games, but there was no background to what his, background is or what his story was or anything like that, other than he's in this construction site and kind of vaguely inspired by Popeye. And Donkey Kong was born, and Pac-Man came before it, 1 year before it. Pac-Man was a huge hit. Donkey Kong was an epic hit, a transformational epic hit, because it was the first video game that actually felt like playing a cartoon. Pac-Man was still kind of a puzzle maze sort of thing. Donkey Kong had a soundtrack, it had characters, it had drama, and the graphics had improved to the point where it actually looked like something you'd see on a cartoon screen. Huge hit. So that's Donkey Kong. And that is the jumping off point for Nintendo becoming an original maker of original content, not just copying other people's stuff, which it had been totally up until that point.
Yeah, I'm sure with that success, they were like, this worked out really well. Let's keep going with this momentum.
Yeah, I honestly, seriously, I don't think Shigeru Miyamoto could have gotten a job at Namco or Taito or Atari or any of those companies. They probably would have laughed him at, what, you've never programmed before? But the way he worked, which is to design the characters and the gameplay, it basically set the stage for the way games should be made in the future going forward. He flipped what was a disadvantage into a huge advantage.
For someone like him, character design is probably one of the most important things about a game.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I spoke to Uemura-san about that, the engineer of the NES, and I was like, why do you think... Because, you have Donkey Kong, and then you have Mario Brothers, and then you have Super Mario Brothers, and then you have Zelda, and you have, all of these different, amazing games coming out of R&D 1, Nintendo's... R&D 1 is mainly the games, and R&D 2 is mainly the hardware, although there was some kind of crossover there. But I said to Uemura-san, I'm like, what was it about this stuff that so gripped the world, including me when we were kids? Why some people in Kyoto had the key to this?
Yeah.
And, at first he's like, I wanted to ask you that. Aren't you writing a book about it? But, I was like, God, yes, but it's my job to ask you. And he told me something really interesting, which is that we got lucky. And I'm like, what do you mean? Just that Miyamoto was really good? And he's like, Miyamoto was really good and like Yokoi was good. We were a good team. But what I mean is unconsciously, Miyamoto and all of us were incorporating motifs from Japanese pop culture into our work, like kawaii culture, like Hello Kitty, the squashed body, the big head, or like power-ups and things like that, like we saw in like manga and anime and like the perspectives and the designs. So the combination of kawaii culture and manga and anime culture, which was really like developing into a powerful force in the late 70s and early 80s, it kind of unconsciously fueled the design of Japanese video games. And it made them seem even more unique and advanced than they might have been, because Americans didn't know any of the references people were basing them on.
Yeah.
We didn't have manga or anime really, not much, or kawaii culture that much in America back then. America saw like Hollywood machismo, like power, strong, manly, masculine. That's why like all the American games of the era are like Missile Command, Battle Zone, tank something, fight, punch, kill. And like all of a sudden these cute games from Japan, like Donkey Kong, like Pac-Man, and many others, Frogger, Dig Dug, they all start coming in and like upending what the conception of cool is single-handedly in America. And obviously Mario played a big part in that. And that's what Uemura-san told me. And I thought it was really interesting. It wouldn't exist without anime and manga and kawaii culture.
Yeah, and all these characters are so iconic, and I'm not going to sidetrack too much because it's something, if you haven't, not you, but like listeners out there haven't listened to it or watched it already, the documentary series High Score on Netflix was really great.
Yep.
And there was one snippet about kind of talking about Donkey Kong and then the lawsuit they had with, the rights to the, was it copyright infringement for Donkey Kong versus King Kong? And then as a thanks to the attorney or lawyer who represented Nintendo, they named Kirby after him.
Nintendo was already like kind of an 800-pound gorilla because it was doing so well. But yeah, just to quickly recap that for people who don't know it, they got sued by, was it Universal Pictures?
Something, yeah.
They got sued by the company who claimed to own, who owned King Kong, and said this is obviously copyright infringement, and all of your base belong to us, basically. And all of the other like companies in America who had licensed Donkey Kong, like ColecoVision, basically folded. They're like, you know what? They're right. They own King Kong. It was only the lawyer who Nintendo hired in the United States had this like inkling. Wait a second, that's a really old movie. Hey, prove that you own the rights to it. And it turned out they didn't. Like that it had passed into the public domain, and so it was a huge win by Nintendo over this American like Hollywood titan. And I think that gave them a lot of confidence too.
Yeah, but then, they were thinking about the American competition, but they weren't thinking about the home competition.
Well, I mean, there is a lot of competition going on at home. What do you mean by that? I'm curious.
Sega.
Yes. But Sega, like, it's interesting. Nintendo dominated for the rest of the 80s. Of course, there's like NEC, who made the PC Engine, known as the TurboGrafx 16 in the States. And then Sega came in. But those console wars, to me, are a very 90s phenomenon. I don't really think they're an 80s one. Do you? Like, when the Sega Genesis came out in, 89?
I think so, yeah. There at the bridge of the 89 to 90, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I was a Genesis guy. I was, hugely. So I was born in 73, right? So, like, the Genesis hit in 89 in the States. So I was like, what would that have made? 16. It was like a sweet spot. It's like black and it has this like chrome on it. And it's like, it's got this really cool computer looking thing. And the games were edgier than Nintendo. Like Nintendo always stayed with this kind of family friendly stuff, right?
Were you a big X-Men fan?
I was a big X-Men fan on Genesis. Yeah. Although my jam on Genesis was a game called Herzog Zwei. It was this real-time kind of strategy game where you played this transforming robot and had to take over the enemy guy's base. But I love the Genesis. I loved so many great games on there. And not all of them Japanese, like, Road Rash or Road Rage.
Yeah, they had a lot of American games on the Genesis.
Amazing. Well, the Genesis also, like, I'm not a big sports guy, but Genesis had a lot of sports games on it that I think.
They did. I have several on that shelf behind me.
Oh, yes.
You or your husband?
Well, all of us. We have a lot of games on that shelf. But
I know Jonathan loves his video games.
They always say a good rivalry makes way for some great development.
Well, and Yamauchi was kind of running the company with an iron fist. Like, he basically forced other companies to kowtow to him. Most famously, the president of Namco, Mr. Nakamura, Namco was like a huge force in the game industry. They were bigger than Nintendo in the late 70s, early 80s. And then the invention of the Famicom. So after they realized Donkey Kong hits big in the arcade, Yamauchi drunkenly calls up Uemura and says, "We need a console. Make me a home TV game." And Uemura's like, "What? Like, we don't have anything like this." And he's praying. Yamauchi's just drunk and forgets about it. But he comes back into work the next day, and like Yamauchi's like, "Where's my game system?" And Yamauchi's like, "Oh man." And so Yamauchi spent the next year or two analyzing all of the American video game systems. Like he bought the Atari 2600, the Odyssey 2, like the ColecoVision, and he told me they literally like used acid to dissolve the casings on the microchips and like blew them up on photographically, put them on the wall and like kind of tracing their lines, because I think they thought, hey, maybe we can kind of copy some of this. It turned out they couldn't. Like, it was all too old-fashioned tech for what they wanted to do. So in a nutshell, what Uemura's team did was miniaturize the entire Donkey Kong arcade architecture into something that could fit into a little box and accept cartridges. The Nintendo Entertainment System was literally benchmarked, designed to run only one game, which is Donkey Kong. And that's how it started. So Donkey Kong was more than a big arcade hit. It was this device. It allowed the creation of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Famicom in Japan. And that was literally it. It was a Donkey Kong machine scaled down pretty much that you could plug into a TV and play at home. That's why actually the Donkey Kong on the Famicom, the NES, is so great. It's like a perfect port of the arcade game. But yeah,
Did you have to blow into that cartridge?
You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that. That's actually bad.
Yeah, that's a big no-no.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I know. And that led to, like, Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers, blah, 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 up to the... you can make this as granular as you want. We could spend, like, hours in the 80s or the 90s, but
that's so much.
But that's the Nintendo history. I think you can say by the Famicom, that's Nintendo. That's the Nintendo we know today, because the Famicom was more than a hit. It was like a kind of society-wide phenomenon. But interestingly enough, Yamauchi and everybody expected that the fad would pass within 3 years. That's why that's the only reason why he said, well, we better make an American version, because it's going to be dead in Japan soon. And so he told Yamauchi, make me an American version, and worked with Nintendo of America, and they did. Yamauchi was wrong. Like, the Famicom was just starting to gain steam. And as we all know, it became a global phenomenon. It didn't, gaming had crashed and cratered in the United States. Like, when Nintendo re-entered the gaming market in the United States, it was seen as a really foolhardy thing to do. Like, all of the industry insiders are like, what? Kids have spoken. They don't like video games, glossing over the fact that it was adults and their crappy E.T. and like all these other really bad games that killed the industry, not kids. And Yamauchi and his people saw that there was an opportunity, and they exploited it, and here we are today.
Yeah.
Making several consoles, one after the other.
Many. I actually think, though, the Famicom, like, if you're talking about transformative game systems, you have the Famicom, of course, because it made modern gaming a thing. Then Gunpei Yokoi came up with the Game Boy in 1989, and I actually think that's the more transformative device.
I was about to ask you, because they've come up with so many, like Virtual Boy, 64, Wii, Switch, etc. over the times, but I feel like it all points back to the portability that comes with the Game Boy, right?
Yeah, the Game Boy is it. It wasn't even a great game system, No. Like, I talked to an American game insider who programmed for it at the time, and she said they called it the Lame Boy. Like, there were, but like spec wise, it was a pale shadow of like the Atari Lynx, for instance, which came out around the same time. But it had the better game library. Like, Nintendo gambled that kids didn't care about the spec. All they cared about was, could they play Mario on it? And they were right, because The Game Boy, the first one was terrible. Like, it didn't have any backlight. Like, you could barely see it.
You may as well have been playing those handheld Tiger games that are like just a little like icon moving around the screen when you press a button. You remember those?
Oh, totally.
I do.
Totally. So I actually think the Game Boy is the most revolutionary thing. And it had like the link cable, which was something Yokoi insisted on putting on there that would let you link them together and like multiplayer and stuff like that. And that like the Nintendo, the Game Boy's portability, its cheapness, and its game library got into all sorts of crazy places. Like adults started playing it. Like there's a really famous photograph of Hillary Clinton playing it on Air Force One. I mean,
oh really?
There's no Nintendo Entertainment System on Air Force One. She brought that on board in her briefcase and played it. So like suddenly you have this, and she's playing Tetris. She's playing a Soviet game on a Japanese game system on Air Force One. If there's a better image of globalization out there of the early 90s, I don't know what it is. It's an amazing moment. Now we're all gaming on the go, with our smartphones in our pockets. The smartphone is now the dominant game system. That's actually so.
Really? You think so?
Oh yeah, no. If you talk about the dominant game systems like as revolutionary types of things, it's the Atari 2600, the Famicom. This is me talking here. The Game Boy, and then I would actually, as much as I love it, skip over the Genesis and go to the Sony PlayStation, which it was hugely transformative because it brought CD players in. And then this might sound a little odd, the Xbox, not because it's a particularly revolutionary system, but because it brought American gaming back into the console sphere. So you have this kind of lineage of things. The Japanese game companies dominated for like 15 years. Like they throughout the end of the 20th century, like no American game company could hope to rival them. It was Nintendo, Sega, Sony, like unbeatable until the Xbox arrived around 2000 and flipped the script again. So it's really amazing.
Before we jump to the future, because there's so much, again, we're running out of time here. We have so much we could talk about. But I did want to ask you one question before, again, we jump to the future. Did you watch the Tetris movie on Apple?
Yes,
TV?
I love the Tetris movie.
I heard it was amazing. It's on my watch list. I haven't had time to watch it, but I have only heard good things about it. And you brought up Tetris just a second ago, so that's why.
No, I must watch. Of course it's stylized, it's exaggerated.
Yeah, of course.
Don't like cite this in your paper on Tetris if you're writing about it at school. But it's great. But it's great. It's really fun. Like when I heard they were doing a Tetris movie, I'm like, you mean like people dressed like blocks doing an interpretive dance?
Didn't they do that with Seth Rogen or something like that?
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah, totally.
Pixel or whatever it was called.
Exactly.
Oh, let's not bring up that.
No.
Crap movie. It was Adam Sandler, excuse me.
Yeah, Adam Sandler.
Like Japanese game movies are dominant now. You have like Super Mario Brothers, the movie.
You and Pat just talked about that on your podcast. I think you both saw it.
Yeah, we did. We did. It's not a movie made for me, but I respect what they did with it.
Oh yeah, it was fun. It was,
yeah. I wish I'd gone and seen it with a little kid. I think it's best viewed with a child.
I speaking as someone who did, it was enjoyable because my son enjoyed it so much.
Exactly.
I think that added to the enjoyment.
The only way I was able to do it was to try to make myself a child by drinking heavily. Before I went in, it kind of worked. I was very childish in the movie theater, but no, seriously, going in sober with a kid is probably the way to appreciate that.
Or you can go in drunk with a kid too.
Or go drunk with a kid. It depends, what kind of parent you are, or what kind of kid you got.
I mean, we're in New Orleans. They serve alcohol at the movie theaters here, so
that's
not only here. But
this is true.
I mean, you are the land of the drive-through cocktail. Are you not?
Yeah.
Wow.
As long as you don't have a straw in it, you're good. You can have it in your car.
Stupidest law, and oh my god, we're so far off course here. But it's the stupidest law. You can literally take the lid off, drink out of it, and then put the lid back on. But as long as the straw hole's not punched, it's not an open container.
We're not off course because remember the Nintendo Entertainment System wouldn't exist without Yamauchi getting drunk one night and telling alcohol is like it's the foundation of all the fun stuff that's happened on our planet.
Yeah, I mean, alcohol seems to help you make you think, because a lot of people, I remember when I was studying abroad, a lot of people would say, oh yeah, I speak Japanese better when I'm drunk.
Yes.
It's just, you feel it's a confidence builder and a barrier remover. That's what it is.
Well, I guess you don't notice when you're having happy accidents. Do you know what I mean? You're just fun about communicating.
Yeah, I wonder how actually I wonder if many of the gaming consoles Nintendo had were like kind of happy accidents in some way.
One of the things I learned about from when I was writing Pure Invention, and this isn't just directed at Nintendo, it's just that nobody has any idea what's going to hit. Nobody. Like, there's a magic to it. And like, you make something, you put it out there, and what really decides what's a hit or not is not the company that made it. It's all of us. It's the people who choose to adopt it. And so the story of Nintendo, without getting too poetic here, is really the story of all of us. All of us pivoting our fantasy lives, our leisure lives, into a new form of entertainment and escape and relaxing, which is, it was provided to us by Nintendo, but like, if we hadn't all chosen to go that direction, Nintendo wouldn't have gone anywhere. So one of the really cool things about a lot of Japanese pop culture is that it's a push-pull. Do you know what I mean? It's like people in Japan make it, but it's the consumers both in Japan and abroad who really make it and take it to the next level. And Nintendo is a great example of that, and a kind of symbol in a lot of ways. I think it is the ultimate fantasy delivery device. The Nintendo Entertainment System and the Game Boy, they just injected Japanese sensibilities into the global mainstream like nothing else had before. So truly transformative company, products, people, and us.
Yeah, and like you mentioned prior to us recording here, I mean, the pandemic, like Animal Crossing, no one saw Animal Crossing being that giant bridge that it became during the pandemic, where it kind of connected people where they couldn't, at a time when they couldn't physically connect, they can now go to their little animal islands and trade vegetables or whatever. I didn't play Animal Crossing. I don't know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, no,
but you know what I mean?
Yeah. Animal Crossing was the pandemic game. Animal Crossing was the pandemic game.
It was.
That same year, an anime became the top grossing movie of the planet. Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer, Mugen Train, Infinity Train. That's a long title.
Yeah.
That became the biggest movie on the planet in 2020. So like, Japanese products like were the life preserver in this really, really horrific time in human history. And we're still seeing it today. Like, Zelda, the Tears of the Kingdom, it sold 10 million copies in 72 hours. That's crazy. That is crazy.
So speaking of Zelda and just the present day, like, where do you see, like, what do you think the future holds for Nintendo, not only in Japan, but in the world, in terms of its position within the global gaming industry? Because a lot of people see PlayStation and even Xbox to an extent physically and like functionality wise, like bringing this like hardware that's mind blowing. Nintendo does too, not to discredit it by any means, but it feels like they're like kind of playing from behind in that category.
Well, they're not behind. They're not behind. Because they deliberately choose off-the-shelf hardware, both because it's cheaper to use. This is something Gunpei Yokoi came up with. He called it lateral thinking with withered technology, which is a complicated way of saying use proven off-the-shelf stuff. Like, don't throw all your money into coming up with something high-tech and cutting-edge and new. Because the bleeding edge is really unstable. There's a high failure rate.
Virtual Boy.
Yeah, exactly. The one time they tried that, it was like a total failure.
Yeah.
So, they stick to tried and true. And it turns out that they've been right. Like, there are a subset of gamers who only want the bleeding edge, but most people just want a solid experience. Like, it doesn't have to be 8K, virtual reality surround sound. It can be cute characters in this well-rendered world that's like within the bounds of what's, the scope of modern technology. They're not always, because Tears of the Kingdom doesn't look a whole lot different from Breath of the Wild. I mean, the gameplay obviously is really cool and there's a lot of new elements, but like visually speaking, it doesn't I'm not like, whoa, a quantum leap. It's pretty much the same thing, just expanded out, which is really what people want. People always say they want something new, but what they really want is old stuff that's kind of disguised as new stuff. And Nintendo is an expert at doing that. And so I think they're going to keep doing it in the future. They're really good at passing the baton to newer generations. Mm-hmm. So even when they've suffered terrible losses, like, Yamauchi, steps down, passes away, or Satoru Iwata passes away, or like, they pass the baton to people who understand the Nintendo ethos. It's a very closed company, which can be a bad thing, but also a good thing too. And like, it has its own culture and its own way of doing things. And I don't think it's nearly as aggressive of a company as it used to be under Yamauchi, but it still very much marches to the beat of its own drummer. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
No, I agree.
Same.
Yeah.
They're going to be jumping over barrels and like hammering, them for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Talking about jumping over barrels and foreseeable future, let's talk about your foreseeable future. Because we're kind of hitting up the time here, and I don't want to leave you without time to talk about your upcoming projects and things you have going on.
Well, thank you.
What barrels are you jumping over, trying to save Pauline from a Donkey Kong?
The people are always asking me when I'm coming out with a sequel to Pure Invention. I would love to, but for the meantime, I've launched a newsletter where I take like kind of headlines and happenings and explore them in long form essays that take a very Pure Invention type approach. And you might be surprised, but it's called Pure Invention, the newsletter. And it's at pureinventionbook.com/newsletter. And I highly recommend everybody, please, if you like Pure Invention or you like this kind of stuff, please check out pureinventionbook.com and navigate to the newsletter, and you'll find much more writing and deep thoughts by Matt Alt on all of this.
Question, your newsletter. So if someone wants to join your newsletter but hasn't done it yet, can they go into a back catalog to
yes.
look at the older ones?
Oh, okay. Yes. Big back catalog up there. It's on the website, pureinventionbook.com. I keep saying it. I feel like $99.99. Buy it now. It's free, but it's free. It's free. Subscriptions greatly appreciated. You can subscribe, but please check it out.
We'll do. And when we release this episode, we'll make sure you put that link to
thank you.
link and everything.
I'm right on the verge. It's hosted in a different place right now, but I'm going to probably migrate to Substack pretty soon. So like the link might have changed by the time we're actually going up. I'll give it to you. It'll be in the show notes.
I'll link up with it. Yeah.
Thank you. Link, just like a hero of a certain game. I want you to adventure through the time to come and find your quest in my newsletter.
I've been intentionally trying to work these names into my sentences throughout, but Mario is really a hard one, and Pikachu is.
Zelda is too. Yeah,
we didn't naturally
we didn't even get to Pikachu, did we? That's a whole.
Earlier in our season,
had an episode on that. We're good.
Yeah. I think people are so tired of hearing about us talking about Pikachu.
I don't choose you, Pikachu. I choose you. I choose you to go away.
If they're interested, they can go back into episodes 2 and 3 and listen to our
Pokemon. Have you heard of this thing? If you haven't heard of this thing, go back and check out the Cruise podcast. Exactly. So, well, thanks for having me on. It was really great, as always.
Thank you for coming on.
It's our pleasure.
I look forward to going through the drive-thru with you and getting a daiquiri next time I'm in town.
Absolutely. That's my pride, my pleasure, and my pride in my city.
Yes.
To get to a drive-thru daiquiri.
I really do want to get out there again soon. I promise I will.
Sounds good, man. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry for the late start, but let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely, man. Thank you.
Excellent.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Crew of Japan podcast. A very special thank you to our friend Matt Alt for joining us today to give us a true history lesson on how Nintendo became the entity it is today. I love these kind of historical deep dives, really finding out how some of the most beloved pop culture icons came to be and the driving forces behind them. If Nintendo would have waited for those rights for Popeye, we would have never had Mario. Wild to think about it. If you haven't already and are interested in learning more about so many various pop culture phenomena and stories relating to Japan, Matt's your dude. I highly suggest checking out Matt's book, Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World, available in paperback, hardback, and audiobook. And while you're at it, check out his Substack, as well as the fun Pure Tokyoscope podcast he records with Patrick Macias. We'll have them all linked out in the show notes. What did you enjoy the most about today's chat with Matt? What surprised you the most about Nintendo's past? Share with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and wherever else you may find us, LinkedIn, at Crew of Japan Podcast. I'll spell it out for you. KREWEOFJAPANPODCAST. Crew of Japan Podcast. While you're there, give us a follow, a like, a retweet, share, repost, comment, whatever floats your boat. Let us know how you're enjoying the podcast. Or perhaps you prefer to provide your feedback in a more private setting. Send us an email at crewofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. I'll spell it one more time. KREWEOFJAPANPODCAST@gmail.com. And remember, we're looking for those emails for a season recap episode, so send them on over. We're waiting for you. And speaking of feedback, if you're enjoying what you're listening to today, or any of the episodes this season or our previous seasons, please feel free to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast streaming app. Every single one of those 5-star ratings and reviews helps others interested in Japan and this kind of content find the podcast. And I'm being 100% sincere when I say that any and all support or ratings and reviews are incredibly appreciated. But that's it for today. Until next time.